Hash the price of freedom. What nobody tells you about being a 1920s flapper. Picture this. It's 2 in the morning, you're hiding in an alley with your best friend, both of you barefoot because your heels broke during a police raid, and you're laughing so hard you can barely breathe. This is freedom in the 1920s, and it's messier, more painful, and far more expensive than any history book ever told you. Tonight, we're pulling back the velvet curtain on what it really costs to be a flapper girl, because rebellion always comes with a receipt, and this one is written in lipstick, tears, and bathtub gin. Before we dive into the chaos, I want to hear from you. If you're enjoying these untold stories from history, go ahead and give this video a like. Subscribe if you want more, but absolutely no pressure. This particular story was requested by someone in our community, and I love hearing what historical rabbit holes help you fall asleep. Check the pinned comment if there's a specific slice of history you'd like me to cover next. And because I'm genuinely curious, drop a comment telling me where you're listening from and what ungodly hour it is where you are. There's something comforting about knowing we're all awake at ridiculous times together, probably making questionable life choices. Now, get comfortable, turn down those lights, and let's talk about the real cost of being modern. This isn't your grandmother's history lesson. This is about the price tag nobody mentions when they romanticize the jazz age. Hash the financial reality nobody discusses. Let's start with the elephant in the speakeasy. Money. Every glossy photograph of a flapper makes it look effortless, but here's what those images don't show. That beaded dress weighing you down cost 3 weeks of salary from your secretarial job. Those silk stockings you're desperately trying to keep from running represent an entire day's wages. That bobbed haircut your mother cried over wasn't just a fashion statement. It was an economic calculation because long hair required expensive products, time-consuming maintenance, and styles that needed professional help. Being a modern woman meant working, which was revolutionary, but it also meant navigating an impossible equation. Your job as a telephone operator or shop girl paid just enough to cover rent if you shared a cramped apartment with 5 other women. Add in stockings that lasted maybe a week if you were careful, cosmetics that promised the world but delivered chemical burns, and the speakeasy cover charges that kept climbing. And suddenly, you're doing financial gymnastics that would make an accountant weep. The mathematics of flapper life were brutal. You needed to look expensive to attract the right kind of attention, the kind that might lead to better opportunities or at least a free dinner, but looking expensive required money you didn't have. So you borrowed dresses, rotated the same 3 outfits among your roommates, and became an expert at making $5 stretch until it screamed for mercy. You learned which restaurants would let you split a sandwich 6 ways without judgment, which drugstore sold nearly expired makeup at a discount, and which landlady might accept rent 3 days late if you charmed her enough. The hidden costs piled up in ways nobody warned you about. Medical bills from dancing injuries that your job's non-existent health coverage wouldn't touch. Fines from police raids that could wipe out a month's savings in one terrifying night. The constant replacement of stockings, shoes, and accessories that couldn't survive the wear and tear of a lifestyle that demanded you look fresh every single evening. You developed a complicated relationship with money, simultaneously cavalier and desperate, spending your last coins on lipstick while wondering how you'd eat until payday. Your friends became your informal banking system, a rotating credit union of borrowed cash, traded favors, and IOUs scribbled on cocktail napkins. You kept mental ledgers of who owed whom, who could be trusted to pay back, and who had mysteriously forgotten about that $5 from 3 weeks ago. The economy of friendship was as complex as any Wall Street transaction, built on trust, necessity, and the shared understanding that you were all one bad week away from disaster. And then there was the matter of actually earning money in the first place. The jobs available to women were limited and limiting. You could be a secretary, typing until your fingers cramped and your eyes blurred from carbon copies. You could be a shop girl, standing on aching feet for 10 hours a day while wealthy customers treated you like animated furniture. You could be a telephone operator, plugging and unplugging cords until the switchboard invaded your dreams. Each job paid a fraction of what men earned for comparable work, and everyone acted like this was not only acceptable but generous. The wage gap wasn't just frustrating, it was mathematically devastating. A male clerk might earn $20 a week while you earned 10 for doing essentially the same work. The justification was always the same. Women didn't need as much money because they lived with family or would eventually marry. Never mind that you were supporting yourself, paying rent, buying food, and trying to maintain the appearance of prosperity on an income designed to keep you perpetually dependent. Saving money was nearly impossible, yet absolutely essential. You needed an emergency fund for the inevitable crises: illness, job loss, family emergencies, or simply the slow accumulation of small disasters that defined working-class life. Every penny you managed to squirrel away represented a sacrifice: a night you stayed home instead of going out, a meal you skipped, a dress you didn't buy. The coffee can under your bed labeled Paris fund held your dreams in nickels and dimes. Growing so slowly, you sometimes wondered if you'd be 70 before you had enough to actually go anywhere. The financial stress was constant and exhausting. You juggled multiple creditors, paying the most aggressive ones first and hoping the others would wait. You became an expert in the art of the excuse, crafting elaborate explanations for late payments that were creative enough to be believable but pathetic enough to inspire sympathy. You learned which shopkeepers would extend credit and which demanded cash up front, which landladies were flexible, and which would evict you without hesitation. And beneath all of this was the knowledge that one stroke of bad luck could unravel everything. A serious illness could mean losing your job and your apartment simultaneously. A family emergency could drain your savings overnight. A police raid at the wrong moment could result in fines you couldn't possibly pay, leading to jail time that would cost you everything you'd worked for. Financial security was an illusion, a pleasant dream you indulged in briefly before reality reasserted itself. The physical toll of fashion. Let's talk about what wearing that iconic flapper look actually did to your body, because history tends to gloss over the medical consequences of beauty. Those darling T-strap heels with the Louis heel weren't just uncomfortable, they were orthopedic nightmares waiting to happen. Every flapper worth her fringe developed calluses that could file metal, bunions that announced themselves in every step, and a permanent wince that she learned to hide behind a dazzling smile. The shoes were instruments of torture disguised as fashion. The heels were high enough to throw your posture forward, forcing you to walk on the balls of your feet in a perpetual state of imbalance. The straps dug into your ankles, leaving red welts that you concealed with strategically applied powder. The pointed toes crushed your feet into unnatural shapes, ensuring that every step was a small act of violence against your own body. By the end of an evening, your feet were screaming, but you couldn't show it because showing pain would mean admitting that maybe this whole modern woman thing was harder than it looked. The compression garments designed to achieve that boyish, straight silhouette weren't corsets, but they weren't exactly comfortable either. The bandeau brassiere was essentially athletic tape with delusions of grandeur, flattening everything into submission and leaving you with restricted breathing and occasional fainting spells that everyone politely ignored. You learned to take shallow breaths, to never bend over too quickly, and to time your inhales with the band's rhythm so nobody noticed. You were essentially wearing a medieval torture device disguised as modern lingerie. The brassiere served a very specific purpose, eliminating any hint of curves that might suggest traditional femininity. The flapper ideal was boyish, angular, flat-chested, and narrow-hipped. If your body didn't naturally conform to this standard, you forced it to comply through compression garments that redistributed flesh and restricted movement. The health consequences were real and rarely discussed. Restricted breathing led to frequent headaches and dizziness. Compressed tissue resulted in poor circulation and constant discomfort. But complaining would mean admitting that fashion hurt, and admitting that fashion hurt would mean giving ammunition to everyone who said women couldn't handle modern life. Makeup in the 20s was a chemical warfare experiment conducted on your face. That luminous pale complexion came courtesy of lead-based powders that slowly poisoned you with every application. The kohl eyeliner contained antimony and other delightful substances that caused eye infections, vision problems, and sometimes temporary blindness. Your lips, stained that perfect crimson, were absorbing dyes originally meant for textiles, not human consumption. You were literally painting yourself with poison, and everyone knew it. But vanity and social pressure trumped minor concerns like long-term health. The cosmetics industry in the 1920s was largely unregulated, a wild west of questionable ingredients and dubious claims. Face powders contained lead, arsenic, and mercury. Lipsticks were made with coal tar dyes that could cause severe allergic reactions. Mascaras were mixed with lampblack and petroleum jelly in conditions that would horrify modern health inspectors. Eyeshadows contained heavy metals that accumulated in your system over time. Hair dyes used toxic chemicals that could cause scalp burns, hair loss, and in extreme cases, neurological damage. You knew these products were dangerous. Everyone knew. The newspapers regularly reported stories of women suffering from cosmetic poisoning, their faces scarred or their health ruined by beauty products. But the social pressure to maintain appearances was overwhelming, and the alternatives were limited. Going barefaced meant being dismissed as dowdy or unfeminine. Using cheaper products often meant accepting even greater risks, as bargain cosmetics were more likely to be adulterated or improperly manufactured. The bob haircut that symbolized freedom came with its own physical price. Those chemical permanent waves used solutions so harsh they could burn your scalp, leaving scabs hidden under your fashionable crop. The Marcel iron, heated over an open flame and applied directly to your hair, caused burns, breakage, and a distinctive smell of singed keratin that became synonymous with beauty salons. You accepted these dangers as the cost of modernity, applying cold cream to burned scalps and telling yourself beauty required sacrifice. Hair maintenance became a regular ordeal of chemical exposure and heat damage. The permanent wave solution was essentially a caustic chemical that broke down the protein bonds in your hair, allowing it to be reshaped before being neutralized with another harsh chemical. The process took hours and left your scalp tender and sometimes blistered. The Marcel iron, meanwhile, was a clamp heated to temperatures that could easily burn skin, wielded by hairdressers whose skill varied wildly. You sat very still and hoped for the best, knowing that one wrong move could result in a chunk of singed hair or a burn that would take weeks to heal. Dancing the Charleston for hours in a crowded, poorly ventilated speakeasy, while wearing restrictive clothing and breathing in second-hand smoke, created a perfect storm of physical stress. You developed chronic knee problems from the repetitive kicking motions, ankle weakness from the constant pivoting in inadequate shoes, and respiratory issues from the toxic combination of cigarette smoke, perfume, and whatever chemicals were being used to mask the smell of illegal alcohol. Your body kept a running tab of every wild night, every reckless dance, every hour spent prioritizing appearance over health. The dance floor was a hazard zone where injuries accumulated like interest on a loan, twisted ankles from missed steps or slippery floors, bruised shins from collision with other dancers, strained backs from the violent twisting motions that characterized popular dances, exhaustion that went beyond simple tiredness, crossing into genuine physical depletion that left you vulnerable to illness and injury. You danced through the pain because stopping would mean admitting weakness, and weakness was not part of the flapper persona. Hash the emotional price of double lives. Here's what no magazine article about flappers ever mentions: the exhausting emotional labor of maintaining two completely different identities. By day, you were the dutiful daughter, the competent employee, the respectable young woman who said yes ma'am and kept her eyes downcast. By night, you transformed into someone entirely different, bold, reckless, the kind of woman who danced on tables and kissed strangers and pretended tomorrow would never come. The constant code switching was mentally exhausting. At breakfast with your family, you carefully edited last night's adventures, turning a speakeasy into a friend's parlor, transforming bootleg gin into lemonade, and never, ever mentioning the boys. You became a skilled liar, not because you wanted to be, but because telling the truth would have meant losing everything. Your family's support, your job, your carefully constructed independence. The lies stacked up like unpaid bills, each one requiring you to remember the previous fabrications, to keep your stories straight, to never slip up even when exhausted. The mental load of maintaining these parallel lives was crushing. You had to remember which version of yourself you'd presented to which audience, what lies you'd told to which people, what details needed to be kept secret from whom. Your mother couldn't know about the speakeasies. Your boss couldn't know about the late nights. Your traditional friends couldn't know about your modern friends. Your modern friends couldn't know how much you sometimes missed the simplicity of your old life. You compartmentalized ruthlessly, keeping each sphere of your life carefully separated, knowing that if they ever collided, the resulting explosion could destroy everything. The judgment was relentless and came from every direction. Your mother looked at your bobbed hair with barely concealed grief, mourning the daughter she thought she knew. Your father alternated between disappointment and confusion, unable to reconcile his little girl with this painted stranger who came home at sunrise. Your boss viewed your modern appearance with suspicion, convinced that any woman who looked like you couldn't possibly be serious about her work. Society pages published articles questioning your morals based solely on your hemline. Every generation faces criticism from the one before it, but the 1920s represented such a dramatic break from the past that the generational divide felt more like a generational chasm. Your parents had been raised in the Victorian era, with its rigid rules about propriety, morality, and women's proper place. To them, your lifestyle wasn't just different, it was incomprehensible, a rejection of everything they believed about how the world should work. They genuinely couldn't understand why you would choose independence over security, why you would risk your reputation for fleeting pleasures, why you would throw away the conventional path they'd assumed you would follow. You carried the weight of being a symbol, representing the modern woman to some and moral decay to others. Every choice you made was scrutinized, debated, and used as evidence for whatever argument someone wanted to make about the state of the world. You couldn't just be a person making your way through life. You had to be a statement, a warning, an inspiration, a cautionary tale. The pressure to represent an entire generation was crushing, especially when you were just trying to figure out who you were. The symbolism extended beyond your personal life into the political and cultural realm. Opponents of women's suffrage pointed to flappers as evidence that women couldn't handle the responsibility of voting. Prohibition supporters cited flapper drinking as proof that alcohol led to moral degradation. Traditional religious leaders used flappers as examples of what happened when society abandoned proper values. You couldn't just live your life. You had to bear the weight of every social anxiety and cultural fear projected onto young women. The emotional toll of constant disapproval wore you down in ways you never anticipated. You developed a hard shell, learning to laugh off insults, to pretend criticism didn't sting, to act like you didn't care what anyone thought. But late at night, when the music stopped and the makeup came off, you wondered if you were making a terrible mistake. You questioned whether freedom was worth the price of your family's disappointment, your community's judgment, your own nagging uncertainty about what came next. The self-doubt was compounded by the fact that you had no roadmap, no examples of how to successfully navigate this new way of being a woman. Previous generations had clear paths laid out for them, even if those paths were restrictive. You were making it up as you went along, with no guarantee that any of it would work out. The uncertainty was terrifying, especially in moments when the costs felt overwhelming and the benefits seemed distant or unclear. And then there was the loneliness, the peculiar isolation of living a life that nobody around you fully understood. Your traditional friends and family couldn't comprehend your choices. Your fellow flappers were competitors as much as companions. You existed in a liminal space, belonging fully to neither world, accepted completely by no one. The freedom you'd fought for sometimes felt like exile, and the independence you'd claimed sometimes felt like abandonment. The friendship dynamics nobody romanticizes. Pop culture loves to show flappers as a tight-knit sisterhood, all supportive and glamorous together. The reality was far more complicated, a volatile mix of genuine affection and ruthless competition, loyalty tested by limited resources and romantic rivalry. Your friends were your lifeline and your greatest source of stress, sometimes simultaneously. Living in close quarters with 5 other women meant that privacy was a luxury and personal boundaries were constantly negotiated. You knew everyone's secrets because the walls were thin and the apartment was smaller. You witnessed every fight, every heartbreak, every financial crisis, and every questionable decision. This forced intimacy created bonds that ran deep, but it also meant that when friendships fractured, the damage was catastrophic because you couldn't escape each other. The physical closeness of shared living spaces created a hothouse atmosphere where tensions could build rapidly. 6 women sharing one bathroom meant that every morning was a battlefield, every evening a negotiation. Someone was always monopolizing the mirror, using the last of the hot water, or leaving wet stockings draped over the radiator. Small annoyances accumulated into major grievances, and major grievances sometimes exploded into shouting matches that left everyone miserable and the living situation unbearable. The competition was subtle but constant. Who got asked to dance first, who attracted the most attention, who landed the better job, who had the nicer dress. Every achievement was celebrated publicly and resented privately, creating a complicated emotional landscape where you genuinely wanted your friends to succeed while simultaneously hoping you'd succeed just a little bit more. The scarcity of good opportunities, decent men, and affordable luxuries turned friendship into a zero-sum game where someone's win often felt like your loss. This competitive dynamic was exacerbated by the reality that you were all competing for the same limited resources. There were only so many good jobs, so many eligible bachelors, so many chances to climb out of the working class and into something better. When your roommate got a promotion, part of you was happy for her, but part of you wondered why it wasn't you, what you lacked, what you needed to do differently. When your friend attracted the attention of a wealthy suitor, you celebrated her good fortune while simultaneously envying her luck and questioning your own appeal. Betrayals, when they came, cut deep precisely because you trusted so completely. The friend who borrowed your best dress and returned it stained. The roommate who flirted with your romantic interest. The confidant who shared your secrets with the wrong person, turning your private confession into public entertainment. These betrayals were devastating not just because of what happened, but because your friends were your chosen family, and their faithlessness left you alone in a world that was already hostile to women like you. The betrayals were often rooted in the same scarcity that drove the competition. Your friend didn't steal your boyfriend because she was malicious. She did it because good men were hard to find, and she couldn't afford to pass up an opportunity. Your roommate didn't gossip about you out of cruelty. She did it to elevate her own social status in a world where reputation was currency. Understanding the motivations didn't make the betrayals hurt less, but it complicated your anger, making it harder to maintain righteous indignation when you knew you might make the same choices in the same circumstances. Yet despite everything, the bonds you formed were real and lasting. The friend who held your hair when you were sick from bad gin, who covered your rent when you came up short, who created a diversion so you could escape an unwanted admirer. These women knew you in ways nobody else could. They'd seen you at your worst, mascara streaked and dignity shattered, and loved you anyway. The friendships that survived the chaos, competition, and close quarters became the strongest relationships of your life, forged in shared struggle and mutual understanding. These deep friendships were built on a foundation of radical honesty that was impossible with anyone else. Your family couldn't know the full truth of your life. Your coworkers couldn't see your vulnerabilities. Your romantic interests couldn't witness your moments of doubt and weakness. But your true friends saw everything and stayed anyway. They knew about the pregnancy scares, the money problems, the family dramas, the career setbacks, the romantic disasters. They held your secrets and trusted you with theirs, creating bonds that went beyond superficial friendship into something that resembled kinship. The flip side of this intimacy was that when these friendships ended, they ended spectacularly. You couldn't drift apart when you lived in the same cramped apartment. You couldn't avoid someone when you moved in the same social circles. Friend breakups required one person to move out to find a new social group, to essentially rebuild their entire life. The stakes were high enough that you tolerated a lot before reaching the breaking point, but once that point was reached, the destruction was total. The professional sacrifices. Working as a modern woman meant navigating a professional world designed to remind you constantly that you didn't belong. Every job came with invisible limitations, unspoken rules about how far you could rise before your gender became an insurmountable obstacle. You were hired to be decorative, competent, and unthreatening, never to actually compete with men for positions of real authority or decent pay. The workplace was structured around the assumption that women's employment was temporary and supplemental. Office layouts reflected this, with women clustered in typing pools or reception areas, while men occupied private offices and conference rooms. The spatial organization reinforced the hierarchy, making it clear that women belonged in support roles, facilitating men's work rather than doing important work themselves. The workplace harassment that was just considered normal would horrify modern sensibilities. Bosses who felt entitled to touch your shoulder, your waist, your hand. Colleagues who made comments about your appearance, your body, your presumed availability. The constant low-level assault of unwanted attention, wandering eyes, and suggestions that your success had nothing to do with your abilities and everything to do with your looks. You learned to deflect, to laugh it off, to never show how much it bothered you, because complaining meant being labeled difficult, and difficult women didn't keep their jobs. The harassment ranged from supposedly benign comments about your appearance to far more aggressive behavior that crossed clear lines. You were expected to smile through it all, to treat groping as mere clumsiness, to interpret sexual propositions as jokes you were too sensitive to appreciate. Fighting back meant risking your job, and your job meant survival. So you developed strategies, never being alone with certain men, always keeping the door open, documenting everything in case you needed evidence later, building alliances with other women who could serve as witnesses and protectors. The pay gap was obscene and openly acknowledged. You did the same work as male colleagues for half the salary, and everyone acted like this was natural and fair. When you asked for a raise, you were told women didn't need as much money because they had husbands or would get husbands or should focus on getting husbands instead of worrying about salary. The assumption that your work was temporary, just something to pass the time until marriage, meant you were never taken seriously no matter how competent you proved yourself to be. The logic of the pay gap was circular and impossible to argue against. Women earned less because their work was less valuable. Their work was less valuable because they were women. Any attempt to point out this logical fallacy was dismissed as emotional or irrational, further proof that women couldn't think clearly enough to deserve equal pay. The system was rigged, and everyone knew it, and most people were perfectly comfortable with that arrangement. Career advancement had a ceiling so low you could touch it without stretching. Secretary was often the highest position available to women, and even that came with the understanding that you were there to make your boss look good, not to have your own ambitions. Any attempt to push for more, to suggest ideas, to demonstrate leadership, was met with amusement or outright hostility. You watched less qualified men get promoted over you repeatedly, their gender qualification enough to overcome any shortcomings in their actual abilities. The promotion process was a master class in frustration and futility. You watched as men you'd trained, men whose work you'd corrected, men who came to you for advice, moved up the ladder while you remained stuck in place. The explanations varied, but the message was consistent. You were valuable where you were. You should be grateful for the opportunities you'd already been given. You shouldn't be so ambitious because it was unbecoming. The message underneath was even clearer. Know your place, accept your limits, don't make waves. The professional costs of your personal choices were steep. That police raid at the speakeasy last week could cost you your job if word got back to your employer. Your bobbed hair and modern style made some employers refuse to hire you, convinced you'd be a bad influence on other female employees. Every choice you made for personal freedom potentially jeopardized your professional stability, forcing you to carefully calculate which battles were worth fighting and which required strategic retreat. Your personal life and professional life could never be fully separated because both were subject to the same moral scrutiny. An employer who learned you frequented speakeasies might fire you for moral turpitude, regardless of your job performance. A boss who disapproved of your appearance might pass you over for opportunities, claiming you didn't have the right image. Your private choices had public professional consequences, creating a surveillance state where you were never truly off duty, never truly free from judgment. The health consequences nobody mentioned. Let's address the elephant everyone pretended not to see: the drinking. Prohibition didn't stop alcohol consumption, it just made it infinitely more dangerous. That bathtub gin you laughed about while drinking it was poisoned, sometimes literally. Industrial alcohol redistilled in someone's basement, flavored with juniper to mask the taste of chemicals that were never meant for human consumption. The government's response to bootlegging included deliberately poisoning industrial alcohol to deter consumption, a policy that killed an estimated 10,000 people during Prohibition. The industrial alcohol used in manufacturing was denatured with toxic additives: methanol, benzene, gasoline, kerosene, chloroform, and other chemicals. Bootleggers attempted to redistill this alcohol to remove the poisons, but the process was imperfect and many toxins remained. Every drink was a game of Russian roulette, a gamble that this particular batch wouldn't be the one that left you blind, paralyzed, or dead. The health effects were immediate and terrifying: women going blind from methanol poisoning, kidney failure from contaminated alcohol, liver damage accumulating from repeated exposure to toxic substances. You knew people who'd gotten sick, really sick, from bad batches. You probably got sick yourself more than once, writing it off as just a bad hangover while your body struggled to process industrial solvents being passed off as gin. The deaths were regular enough that they barely made the news unless they happened in large numbers. A girl you knew from the department store died after a night of drinking, her kidneys failing within days. A friend's brother went blind from bad gin, his sight lost forever from a single evening's indulgence. These tragedies were treated as cautionary tales, warnings to be more careful, as if there was a way to safely consume poison if you just exercised good judgment. The chronic sleep deprivation took its toll in ways you didn't fully recognize until years later. Your body needed rest, but the flapper lifestyle demanded you work all day and party all night, running on coffee, cigarettes, and sheer determination. The exhaustion accumulated, affecting your immune system, your mental health, your ability to make good decisions. You were always tired, always pushing through, always one bad night away from complete collapse. The sleep deprivation was cumulative and insidious. You functioned on 4 or 5 hours of sleep per night, making up the deficit with caffeine and adrenaline, convincing yourself you were fine even as your body gradually broke down. Your immune system weakened, leaving you vulnerable to every illness that passed through your crowded apartment or workplace. Your judgment deteriorated, leading to decisions you wouldn't have made with a rested brain. Your emotional regulation suffered, making small setbacks feel like catastrophes and minor conflicts escalate into major dramas. Sexually transmitted infections were common and discussed in whispers if at all. Medical care for these conditions was limited, expensive, and came with heavy doses of judgment and shame. You knew girls who disappeared for weeks, returning thin and pale with stories about visiting family that everyone pretended to believe. The fear of pregnancy or disease hung over every romantic encounter, a constant anxiety that no amount of careful behavior could completely eliminate. The medical treatment for sexually transmitted infections was often as traumatic as the infections themselves. The available treatments were painful, toxic, and not always effective. Mercury compounds, arsenic-based drugs, and other harsh chemicals were used to treat syphilis and gonorrhea, causing their own serious side effects while not always curing the original infection. The treatments required multiple painful injections over weeks or months, and even then success wasn't guaranteed. Pregnancy was an even greater terror because the options were all terrible. If you were unmarried, pregnancy meant social ruin, job loss, and possible abandonment by your family. Abortion was illegal and dangerous, performed in back rooms by practitioners whose qualifications ranged from questionable to non-existent. The procedures often resulted in infections, hemorrhaging, or permanent infertility, and sometimes death. If you carried the pregnancy to term, you faced the choice of keeping a child you couldn't afford to raise or giving it up for adoption and living with that loss forever. The mental health crisis was real but unacknowledged. Depression, anxiety, the crushing pressure of maintaining your double life while facing constant judgment, these took their toll. You had friends who cracked under the pressure, who returned home in defeat, who made desperate choices born of exhaustion and despair. There was no therapy, no support groups, no acknowledgement that the price of freedom might include your mental well-being. Mental illness was stigmatized to the point of being unspeakable. If you admitted to feeling depressed or anxious, you risked being labeled hysterical or unstable, diagnoses that could result in institutionalization against your will. The treatments available were crude and often harmful. Rest cures that isolated women in darkened rooms for weeks, tonics containing alcohol and opiates that created dependency, and for severe cases, institutional commitment that could last for years or become permanent. The coping mechanisms available were themselves problematic. You drank to manage anxiety, creating the risk of dependency and the certainty of hangovers that made everything worse. You smoked to calm your nerves, developing a nicotine addiction that would plague you for decades. You pushed yourself harder, hoping that staying busy would keep the dark thoughts at bay, but exhaustion only made you more vulnerable. The cycle was vicious and largely invisible, because admitting struggle meant admitting weakness, and weakness meant losing everything you'd fought to achieve. The endgame nobody planned for. Here's the question nobody wanted to ask. What happens next? The flapper lifestyle was thrilling but unsustainable, a sprint that couldn't last forever. Your body couldn't maintain this pace indefinitely. Your finances couldn't withstand the constant drain. Your relationships couldn't survive the chaos. And yet nobody talked about what came after, what happened when the music stopped and you were still standing there in your beaded dress with no plan for tomorrow. The unsustainability was built into the lifestyle from the beginning. You couldn't dance until sunrise and work a full day indefinitely without your health collapsing. You couldn't spend every penny on appearances while building no financial security without eventually facing crisis. You couldn't maintain double lives and fractured relationships without something eventually breaking. The flapper years were borrowing against a future that would eventually demand payment, with interest. Some women found conventional endings, marriage that required them to abandon everything they'd fought for, trading independence for security and pretending the wild years never happened. They cut their hair back to acceptable lengths, packed away the beaded dresses, and settled into lives of quiet respectability haunted by memories of who they used to be. The transformation was painful, a kind of death of self that left them wondering late at night if they'd made the right choice. These marriages often felt like surrender, a retreat from the battle for independence after the costs became too high to bear. The men they married sometimes knew about their wild pasts, sometimes didn't, but either way expected those pasts to stay buried. You learned to never mention the speakeasies, the dancing, the freedom you'd tasted. You learned to act as though you'd always been the respectable woman your husband believed he'd married. The erasure was complete and permanent, your flapper self locked away like an embarrassing secret. Others burned out spectacularly, the lifestyle catching up with them in dramatic fashion. Health crises, financial ruin, scandals that made continuing impossible. These women disappeared from the scene, their absence noted briefly before everyone moved on to the next party, the next drama, the next crisis. Their stories became cautionary tales, whispered warnings about what happened when you pushed too hard for too long. The burnout victims were visible reminders of the stakes involved in flapper life. The woman whose drinking destroyed her liver before she turned 30. The girl who got pregnant and disappeared, never to be heard from again. The friend who had a nervous breakdown and was institutionalized, her laughter and light extinguished by the pressure she couldn't withstand. These stories circulated as warnings, but they rarely changed behavior because everyone believed it wouldn't happen to them, that they were smarter or luckier or stronger than the women who'd failed. A few, the lucky or determined or crazy ones, found ways to build sustainable lives that incorporated their independence without requiring constant chaos. They built careers, formed chosen families, created lives that didn't require them to choose between freedom and stability. These women were rare, pioneers figuring it out as they went, with no roadmap and plenty of judgment from both the conventional and the rebellious. These success stories offered hope but also highlighted how exceptional you had to be to make it work. You needed luck, the right opportunities, the right mentors, the right timing. You needed resources, enough money to weather setbacks, enough connections to open doors, enough education to compete in professional fields. You needed resilience, the ability to keep going despite constant obstacles, to recover from failures, to maintain your sense of self despite pressure to conform. Most women didn't have all these ingredients, and even those who did often fell short through no fault of their own. The truth nobody wanted to face was that being a flapper was often a temporary identity, a phase between the traditional life you'd rejected and whatever came next. The transition out was rarely smooth, requiring you to either abandon your principles or figure out how to survive as a genuinely independent woman in a world not designed for that possibility. Most women ended up somewhere in the middle, compromising, adapting, carrying the scars and lessons of their wild years into whatever came next. The compromise was perhaps the most common outcome, a negotiation between what you'd hoped for and what was actually possible. You kept some of your independence, but accepted more restrictions than you'd wanted. You maintained some of your freedom, but gave up more than you'd intended. You stayed true to some of your principles, but abandoned others under pressure. The middle path was neither the triumph of complete independence nor the defeat of total surrender, but rather the messy reality of trying to build a sustainable life in a world that wasn't ready for women like you. The toll on romantic relationships. Romance in the flapper era was a minefield of impossible expectations and contradictory demands. You were supposed to be alluring but pure, experienced but innocent, independent but ultimately willing to submit to marriage. The modern woman was attractive in theory, but terrifying in practice to men raised in a completely different world with completely different expectations. The dating landscape was treacherous precisely because the rules had changed but nobody could agree on what the new rules were. Traditional courtship involved chaperones, formal calling hours, and a slow progression toward marriage supervised by families. Flapper dating involved unsupervised meetings, physical intimacy, and a general sense that the old rules no longer applied. But how far the rules had changed, what was now acceptable and what remained taboo, varied wildly depending on who you asked. The good men, the ones who genuinely respected your independence and admired your spirit, were often too intimidated to pursue you seriously. They worried they couldn't keep up, couldn't match your energy, couldn't reconcile their traditional expectations of marriage with your obvious desire for something different. You scared them in ways neither of you could articulate, and so they chose safer, more conventional women while you collected their half-hearted flirtations and forgotten promises. These men wanted to be progressive, genuinely admired your courage and independence, but when it came time to make a serious commitment, they retreated to what they knew. They married the quiet girls who didn't challenge them, who fit more easily into the lives they'd always imagined for themselves. You understood their choice even as it hurt, because you recognized that building a life with you would require them to become different men. And most people aren't capable of that kind of transformation, even when they want to be. The bad men saw your modernity as an invitation, reading your bobbed hair and shortened skirts as a promise of easy virtue. They pursued you aggressively, assuming you were available for entertainment, but never for anything serious. These men wanted all the fun of a modern woman without any of the commitment, happy to dance and drink and fool around, but shocked and offended when you expected actual respect or consideration. They treated you like an exciting deviation from the norm, thrilling but ultimately disposable. These men were everywhere, armed with smooth lines and empty promises. They told you that you were different from other girls, that they'd never met anyone like you, that they were falling in love. They meant it in the moment, carried away by the excitement and novelty. But when morning came, or when things got serious, or when their families started asking questions, they disappeared. You learned to spot the patterns, the familiar scripts, but sometimes loneliness or hope made you ignore the warning signs even when you knew better. The emotional labor of dating was exhausting. You had to be interesting but not intimidating, attractive but not too available, fun but not too wild. Every interaction was a careful calibration, trying to find the impossible balance between being yourself and being what men claimed they wanted. You learned to read situations quickly, to identify red flags, to extract yourself from promising encounters that revealed themselves as dead ends or worse. The constant performance required for dating left you drained and confused about who you actually were versus who you were pretending to be. After enough dates where you modulated your personality to match expectations, you started to lose track of your authentic self. Were you naturally this vivacious, or was that just the character you played? Did you actually enjoy this, or were you performing enjoyment because that's what was expected? The line between genuine feeling and strategic presentation blurred until you couldn't always tell the difference. Heartbreak was common and complicated by the fact that your romantic choices carried social consequences. Fall for the wrong man, and suddenly you were the subject of gossip that could damage your reputation permanently. Get too serious too fast, and you risked being labeled desperate. Play the field and you were called fast or worse. The judgment never stopped, and every romantic decision was scrutinized, interpreted, and used as evidence of your moral character or lack thereof. The gossip network operated with terrifying efficiency. If you were seen leaving a speakeasy with a man, by morning everyone knew, and by afternoon they decided what it meant about your virtue. If you dated multiple men, you were collecting bows like souvenirs, proof of moral deficiency. If you stayed single, you were either too picky or too damaged or secretly involved with someone inappropriate. There was no winning, no way to conduct your romantic life that wouldn't result in judgment and speculation. Physical intimacy carried enormous risks that fundamentally shaped romantic relationships. Without reliable contraception, every sexual encounter carried the possibility of pregnancy, a consequence that would destroy your independence overnight. The fear was constant and well-founded. You knew women whose lives had been derailed by pregnancy, who'd lost everything they'd worked for because of one moment of passion or carelessness or simple bad luck. The available contraceptive methods were unreliable, illegal, or both. Condoms existed but were expensive, hard to obtain, and not always effective. Diaphragms required a doctor's fitting, and a prescription that many doctors refused to provide to unmarried women. Withdrawal was free but highly unreliable. The rhythm method required mathematical precision and regular cycles that stress and malnutrition made impossible. You relied on luck and prayer and the grim knowledge that if your luck ran out, your options were all terrible. The double standard was infuriating and inescapable. Men who slept around were sophisticated, experienced, sowing their wild oats. Women who did the same were ruined, damaged goods, morally compromised. A man could have a sexual past and still be considered marriage material. A woman with the same history was unmarriageable, her value permanently diminished by experiences that enhanced a man's worth. You navigated this landscape knowing that the rules were unfair, but that breaking them would cost you everything. The social isolation. Despite the crowds and the parties and the constant social whirl, flapper life could be profoundly lonely. You existed between worlds, too modern for traditional society but never quite secure in your place among the rebellious. The sense of belonging you sought often remained frustratingly out of reach, leaving you surrounded by people but feeling fundamentally alone. Your family relationships suffered under the strain of your choices. Sunday dinners became battlefields where every topic was a potential landmine. Your mother's sighs of disappointment, your father's uncomfortable silences, your siblings' confusion or envy, all created an atmosphere where you could never fully relax. You loved your family but couldn't be yourself around them, and the gap between who you were and who they wanted you to be grew wider with each passing year. The family gatherings that should have been sources of comfort became performances of a self you no longer inhabited. You put on more modest clothing, toned down your makeup, watched your language and your stories. You pretended to be interested in suitable marriage prospects and appropriate career paths. You smiled and nodded through lectures about settling down and becoming serious. The effort of maintaining this facade was exhausting, and the knowledge that your family loved a version of you that no longer existed was deeply painful. Traditional friends from your past dropped away, unable to understand your new life or unwilling to be associated with your scandalous reputation. The girls you'd grown up with were marrying, having children, settling into conventional lives that looked nothing like yours. When you encountered them, the conversations were stilted and strange, both of you struggling to find common ground that no longer existed. They looked at you with a mixture of envy and pity, and you looked at them the same way. These lost friendships hurt more than you expected. These were women who'd known you before, who remembered who you'd been when you were still figuring out who you wanted to become. Their absence meant losing connection to your own past, to the parts of yourself that existed before you became a flapper. You sometimes wondered what they talked about when you weren't there, whether they pitied you or envied you or simply no longer thought about you at all. Your fellow flappers provided companionship but rarely true intimacy. The competitive dynamics, the constant turnover of the social scene, the way people disappeared from the circuit due to pregnancy or marriage or scandal, all made deep, lasting friendships difficult. You had drinking buddies and dance partners and confidants for specific situations, but few relationships that felt solid enough to withstand real hardship. The transience of flapper friendships meant you were constantly rebuilding your social circle. Someone would become your closest friend for 3 months and then disappear, having gotten married or moved to another city or simply drifted away. You learn not to invest too deeply, to enjoy companionship without depending on it, to accept that most relationships would be temporary. This self-protection was necessary, but also meant you rarely experienced the kind of deep, enduring friendship that provides real security and support. The romantic relationships that defined so much of social life were equally unstable. Partners came and went, intensity giving way to boredom or conflict or simply the arrival of someone new and exciting. You learn not to plan too far ahead, not to invest too much meaning in declarations made after the third drink, not to mistake passion for commitment. The emotional self-protection required to survive serial heartbreak left you somewhat armored, capable of intimacy, but rarely vulnerable enough for real connection. At work, you couldn't fully be yourself either. Your flapper persona had to be toned down for professional settings, your stories carefully edited, your weekends described in terms that wouldn't scandalize or concern your employers. Your coworkers knew a work-appropriate version of you, friendly but not too familiar, competent but not threatening, modern enough to be interesting but not so modern as to be concerning. The result was a kind of existential loneliness, a sense that nobody really knew you completely. Your family knew who you'd been but not who you'd become. Your flapper friends knew your current self but not your history or your doubts. Your romantic partners knew the exciting version you presented but rarely the vulnerable, uncertain person underneath. You existed in fragments, different pieces of yourself distributed across different relationships, nowhere fully integrated or fully known. The physical spaces of flapper life. The environments where flapper life unfolded were far less glamorous than photographs suggest. Those speakeasies that looked sophisticated in dim lighting were often dingy, poorly ventilated spaces with questionable sanitation and constant threats of violence or police raids. The romance of secret passwords and hidden entrances couldn't fully compensate for the reality of overcrowded fire hazards with emergency exits that might be blocked or non-existent. The typical speakeasy was located in a basement, a back room, or a converted residential space never designed to hold dozens of people. The air was thick with cigarette smoke, perfume, sweat, and the sharp chemical smell of bootleg alcohol. Ventilation was minimal because windows were covered to prevent detection. The heat from packed bodies and inadequate air circulation created a sweltering atmosphere where you could feel the sweat trickling down your spine and taste the smoke with every breath. The furniture was mismatched and rickety, tables wobbling on uneven floors, chairs missing rungs or sporting suspicious stains. The floors themselves were often damaged, with loose boards that caught heels and created tripping hazards. The bathrooms, when they existed, were barely functional, with plumbing that frequently backed up and mirrors so dirty you could barely see your reflection. You learned to use the facilities as quickly as possible, touching as little as necessary, and always checking for basic supplies before committing to the attempt. The lighting was deliberately dim, both for atmosphere and to hide the shabby reality of the spaces. This romantic dimness made it difficult to see who you were talking to, what was in your drink, or where the exits were located. You navigated by memory and touch, careful of obstacles you couldn't quite see, aware that the darkness that seemed so sophisticated also created opportunities for unwanted contact and made escape routes harder to find. Your shared apartment, meanwhile, was a study in making do with insufficient space and resources. 6 women in a space designed for 2 meant that every surface served multiple purposes and privacy was purely theoretical. The bedroom you shared with 2 others featured 3 beds crammed so close together that you had to climb over your roommates to reach your own. Storage was a constant challenge, with everyone's possessions jumbled together in makeshift arrangements that bred resentment and frequent accusations of theft. The kitchen was barely functional, with a hot plate that worked intermittently, a sink that drained slowly or not at all, and an ice box that struggled to keep anything cold. Cooking was more a theoretical possibility than a practical reality, which is why so much of your diet consisted of food that didn't require preparation or items purchased from street vendors of questionable hygiene standards. The kitchen table served as dining area, desk, makeup station, and general gathering spot, perpetually cluttered with the debris of 6 busy lives. The single bathroom was the source of endless conflict and ingenious adaptation. With 6 women sharing one toilet, one sink, and one bathtub, Efficiency was mandatory, and privacy was impossible. You learned to perform your entire morning routine in under 10 minutes, to bathe in 3 inches of lukewarm water to conserve hot water for others, to brush your teeth at the kitchen sink when the bathroom line was too long. The medicine cabinet was a jumbled mess of shared and hoarded products, and the towel situation was a constant source of passive-aggressive warfare. The heating was inadequate in winter and non-existent in summer. You layered clothing in cold months and sweltered in warm ones, the windows stuck shut in summer providing no relief from the heat. The radiator clanged and hissed but provided limited warmth, leaving the apartment perpetually drafty with cold spots that made you grateful for the body heat of cramped living. In summer, the lack of air circulation turned the apartment into an oven, making sleep nearly impossible and tempers perpetually short. The neighborhood itself was often transitional or marginal, chosen for affordability rather than safety or convenience. You navigated streets where harassment was common and danger was real, learning which blocks to avoid after dark and which alleys offered shortcuts versus which invited trouble. The walk home from a late night out required vigilance and often company, the darkened streets populated by people whose intentions weren't always benign. The constant threat of violence. This is the part of flapper history that gets glossed over in favor of more romantic narratives, but the threat of violence was constant and came from multiple directions. The speakeasy raids weren't just exciting close calls, they were genuinely dangerous situations where people got hurt. Police officers hopped up on moral righteousness, and armed with billy clubs didn't always discriminate between bootleggers and customers, and the crush of panicked people trying to escape through limited exits resulted in injuries ranging from minor to fatal. You witnessed violence regularly, normalized it because there was no alternative. The fight that broke out when someone looked at someone else's date too long. The woman who got slapped by her boyfriend in the middle of the dance floor while everyone pretended not to notice. The man who grabbed your wrist hard enough to leave bruises when you refused another drink. The bouncer who got too rough ejecting someone, fists flying and blood spattering on the floor while the band played on, and you kept dancing because stopping would mean acknowledging what you'd seen. The bootleggers who ran the speakeasies were criminals, often violent ones, involved in activities far more serious than serving illegal alcohol. Turf wars between rival gangs meant that being in the wrong place at the wrong time could get you killed. You heard stories of speakeasies where shootings had occurred, where bodies had been found, where the violence of organized crime spilled over onto regular customers who just wanted a drink and a dance. Sexual violence was an ever-present threat that shaped your behavior in countless ways. You never walked alone at night if you could avoid it. You never accepted drinks you hadn't watched being poured. You never let yourself get too drunk to maintain awareness of your surroundings. You developed strategies for extracting yourself from dangerous situations, code words with friends, lies that could diffuse aggressive men, routes home that avoided the most dangerous areas. The knowledge that reporting sexual assault would likely result in your character being destroyed rather than your attacker being punished meant that most incidents went unreported. If you were assaulted, the questions would focus on your behavior, your clothing, your consumption of alcohol, your presence in a speakeasy. You would be the one on trial, your morals examined and found wanting, while your attacker walked free. The injustice was total, but the pattern was so well established that fighting it seemed futile. Domestic violence among your peers was common and rarely discussed. You knew women who showed up with suspicious bruises, with explanations that didn't quite make sense, with a jumpiness around their partners that spoke volumes. You knew that mentioning it would likely make things worse rather than better, that intervening could result in losing a friend who wasn't ready to leave, that the resources available to women in abusive situations were virtually non-existent. The police, who should have been sources of protection, were often sources of danger. Officers who caught you during a speakeasy raid might offer to forget they saw you in exchange for favors you had no interest in providing. Cops on the beat might harass women walking alone, demanding to know where you were going and what you were doing, making it clear that your presence in public space was subject to their approval. The power dynamic was impossible to escape, and complaining meant risking arrest on vague charges of public indecency or disturbing the peace. The cost of looking modern. We've discussed the physical toll of fashion, but the financial and time costs deserve their own examination. Looking like a proper flapper required constant investment of both money and labor, creating a second job that consumed hours and dollars you could barely spare. The upkeep on a single outfit was endless. Those beaded dresses couldn't just be thrown in the wash. They required careful hand cleaning or expensive dry cleaning that left you choosing between cleanliness and eating. The beads fell off constantly, requiring painstaking repair work that consumed your evenings. A single night of dancing could result in enough damage to require hours of mending, and if the damage was too extensive, the dress became unwearable until you could afford to have it professionally repaired. Stockings were a constant expense that added up to shocking amounts. At $1 a pair, which represented several hours of work at many jobs, and a lifespan measured in wearings rather than weeks, you could easily spend a quarter of your income just on hosiery. The runs were inevitable, appearing at the slightest provocation and rendering the stockings unwearable in polite company. You learned to mend runs with nail polish or careful stitching, to wear strategically positioned garters to hide the damage, to rotate damaged stockings to situations where nobody would notice. The shoes required constant repair and eventual replacement. Those delicate heels wore down quickly on city streets. The straps broke from the stress of dancing. The soles developed holes that let in water and cold. A good cobbler became essential, someone who could rebuild your shoes enough times to delay the expensive inevitability of replacement. You learned to walk carefully to preserve your shoes, to carry flats for the walk home, and only put on your good shoes when you arrived at your destination. Cosmetics represented another steady drain on your finances. The products were expensive relative to their size and depleted quickly with daily use. A tube of lipstick might last a month if you were careful, less if you weren't. Face powder disappeared at an alarming rate. Mascara dried out and needed replacing. Rouge compacts shattered when dropped. The economics of beauty meant that looking modern cost the equivalent of weeks of groceries each month, forcing impossible choices between appearance and other necessities. The time investment was equally substantial. Your morning routine consumed an hour or more, time you could barely spare when you needed to be at work. The evening transformation took even longer, as you removed the subtle makeup appropriate for work and applied the dramatic looks required for nightlife. Hairstyling could take an hour, particularly if you were attempting finger waves or pin curls. The math was brutal. Between getting ready for work, getting ready for evening, and the actual commute and activities, you had perhaps 4 hours a day for sleep, eating, and everything else. The exploitation nobody discussed. The flapper lifestyle created markets, and those markets attracted people eager to profit from young women with limited resources and desperate desires to be modern. The exploitation was everywhere once you learned to see it, from the landlords who charged premium prices for substandard housing, to the speakeasy owners who watered down already dangerous alcohol and charged exorbitant prices to the cosmetics companies that sold poisonous products without warning labels. The fashion industry cynically marketed to flappers while simultaneously contributing to the moral panic about them. Department stores sold the latest styles, while their managers refused to hire women who wore those same styles. Magazines promoted flapper fashion while running articles condemning flapper morals. The hypocrisy was total, but the profit motive was clear. Keep young women insecure and consuming, selling them the very things that would be used as evidence against their character. The beauty industry was particularly predatory, preying on insecurities while creating new ones. Advertisements suggested that without the right products you would be ugly, unwanted, failures at modern womanhood. The products themselves ranged from useless to actively harmful, but they were marketed with scientific-sounding claims and testimonials from fabricated experts. The message was consistent. You weren't good enough as you were, but purchasing these products might make you acceptable. The entertainment industry exploited flappers while condemning them. Movies featured flappers as exciting but cautionary figures, women who had adventures but usually faced consequences. Jazz clubs and speakeasies charged admission and inflated drink prices, extracting maximum profit from young women's desire to participate in modern culture. The owners often had contempt for their customers, viewing them as marks to be separated from their money rather than patrons to be valued. The loan sharks and installment plan operators specifically targeted young working women, offering credit for clothing and cosmetics at usurious rates. You could buy now and pay later, except the paying lasted months, and the interest charges turned a $10 dress into a $20 burden. Many women found themselves trapped in cycles of debt, working to pay off purchases they'd made months ago while taking on new debt to maintain appearances. The men who frequented speakeasies and jazz clubs often viewed the women there as available for purchase, assuming that the price of a few drinks entitled them to physical access and romantic attention. The transactional nature of these interactions was barely disguised, with women expected to provide companionship and affection in exchange for being treated to an evening out. Refusing this exchange meant being labeled a tease or gold digger. Accepting it meant validating the assumption that your time and attention were for sale. The legacy they didn't know they were creating. The women living through the flapper era couldn't see the full arc of what they were accomplishing. They were too busy surviving, too focused on immediate concerns of rent and reputation, and where the next party would be. They didn't know they were pioneers, didn't understand that their struggles and choices would reshape possibilities for generations to come. Every time you bobbed your hair despite your mother's tears, you made it slightly easier for the next woman to make the same choice. Every time you kept your job despite pressure to marry, you proved that women could be economically independent. Every time you danced until dawn and showed up for work the next morning, you demonstrated that women could have both professional lives and personal pleasures. The accumulation of these individual acts of defiance created collective change that nobody fully anticipated. The professional barriers you fought against began to crack because you refused to accept them as permanent. Your presence in workplaces, your competence, your refusal to be dismissed or diminished, all contributed to slowly changing expectations about what women could do. The change was glacial and often felt non-existent, but it was real. Each generation of women entered workplaces that were slightly more accepting, slightly more equal, because of battles fought by the generation before. The social freedoms you claimed, at great personal cost, expanded the range of acceptable behavior for all women. The scandal of bobbed hair and short skirts faded as those styles became normalized. The shocking idea of women in speakeasies became unremarkable as prohibition ended, and women's presence in public spaces became ordinary. The notion that women might have romantic or sexual agency, so threatening in the 1920s, gradually became integrated into changing social norms. But the legacy is complicated because the costs were real and the gains were partial. Many flapper-era women ended their lives in conventional marriages, their wild years forgotten or deliberately erased. The economic independence they'd fought for often proved temporary, ending with marriage or motherhood or simple exhaustion. The sexual freedom they'd claimed came with consequences that men didn't face, double standards that persisted long after the flapper era ended. The health costs they paid, the damaged bodies and compromised mental health and addiction issues, these rarely made it into the triumphant narrative of liberation. The women who went blind from bootleg gin, who died from botched abortions, who suffered from chronic health issues related to cosmetics or restrictive clothing, their stories were cautionary footnotes rather than central narratives. The price of progress was paid in individual suffering that aggregated into social change. A final accounting. So here's the truth about being a 1920s flapper that history books don't quite capture. It cost everything. It cost money you didn't have, health you couldn't afford to lose, relationships that couldn't be rebuilt, parts of yourself you'd never recover. It cost you your family's approval, your community's respect, your own certainty about who you were and what you wanted. It cost you safety, security, and the comfort of conventional paths. The expenses were itemized on a ledger written in multiple currencies. There were the literal financial costs, the stockings and dresses and cosmetics, the speakeasy cover charges and fines from police raids, the medical bills and the loans taken at predatory rates. There were the physical costs, the damaged feet and backs, the cosmetic poisoning, the effects of chronic sleep deprivation and toxic alcohol, the injuries from dancing and violence and simple wear and tear. There were the emotional costs, the strained family relationships and fractured friendships, the heartbreaks and betrayals, the loneliness of existing between worlds with full belonging in neither. There were the professional costs, the harassment endured, the promotions denied, the income gap accepted, the constant awareness that your career was contingent and temporary. There were the psychological costs, the anxiety and depression, the identity confusion, the weight of being a symbol when you were just trying to be a person. But here's what else is true. They paid it anyway. They looked at that impossible price tag and decided it was worth it. Not because they were reckless or foolish or didn't understand the costs. They understood perfectly, bore the consequences in their bodies and hearts and bank accounts. They paid it because the alternative was worse, because staying within traditional boundaries felt like slow suffocation, because they wanted to prove that women could be something other than what everyone expected. They paid it because they believed, or at least hoped, that their struggle might make things easier for women who came after, that their daughters wouldn't face the same stark choices between independence and approval, that the ground they'd broken, at such personal cost, might become a foundation others could build on, that their suffering might purchase something valuable, even if they couldn't see what that was from where they stood. And they were right partially. The world did change, slowly and incompletely, in directions their struggles helped shape. Women's economic participation, social freedom, sexual agency, all expanded in ways that built on flapper-era challenges to restrictive norms. Not enough, never enough, but more than if no one had fought. The costs were real and the gains were limited, but the connection between the two was also real. Where it leaves us. As you drift off to sleep tonight, comfortable and safe in ways those women could barely imagine, consider what they bought with their suffering. You can work without it being considered scandalous. You can cut your hair without your mother going into mourning. You can go out in the evening without a chaperone and return without explaining yourself. You can wear clothing that's comfortable instead of decorative. You can make choices about your body and your life that those women couldn't. You have options they helped create, even though they paid a price you'll never fully appreciate because you don't have to. The health care that protects you from cosmetic poisoning, the labor laws that limit your work hours, the contraception that gives you reproductive control, the legal protections against discrimination and harassment, none of these existed for them. They lived in a world actively hostile to women's independence, and they fought for it anyway, knowing they'd likely lose but hoping the defeat might be partial. So yes, be grateful for modern plumbing and safe cosmetics and stockings that actually stay up. Be grateful for antibiotics and reliable contraception and workplace protections. Be grateful for all the things that make modern life immeasurably easier than flapper life ever was. But also be grateful for their stubborn, expensive, ultimately partial victories, because those victories made your options possible. Remember them accurately, not as glamorous party girls in a romantic past, but as real women who paid brutal prices for limited gains. Remember the costs they bore so you wouldn't have to. Remember that progress isn't inevitable or automatic, that every expansion of freedom required someone to fight for it, usually at great personal expense. And maybe, just maybe, consider what costs you're willing to bear for the next generation. What battles you'll fight even though you'll pay the price while others reap the benefits. What prices you'll pay to expand options for people who will never know your name or understand your struggle. Because that's how change actually happens, through accumulated individual sacrifices that create collective gains measured in generations rather than lifetimes. Sleep well, dream deeply, and remember that you're sleeping in a world they helped build, one questionable decision and enormous sacrifice at a time. The price of freedom is always high, but the price of its absence is higher. They understood that in ways we can barely imagine, and they paid anyway. Good night.